Good evening, everyone. It is so good to have you with us this evening. I'm Andrew, a final year at the University of Kent.
And I am Bryony. I'm a second year student at Christchurch. And whether you are here for the first time this evening or you are joining us again, it is so great to have you with us.
Tonight's theme is real disappointment, and hopefully you won't leave here feeling disappointed. At least the person who wins a Just Eat voucher definitely won't be. We've got a great evening in store for you. We've got one of our guest speakers, Joe, speaking to us from Mark's Gospel. There'll also be a live Q&A afterwards, giving you a chance to ask any of your questions to him. There's also loads of ways to get in touch this evening. There is a Slido code beneath me. Feel free to get in touch and send in your questions through the code. And you can also comment on YouTube and on Facebook, and we will be in touch.
So every day this week, we have had a Would You Rather over on our social media. And today's Would You Rather is, would you rather that every time you go out for a meal, they don't have what you want, or every time you go to the beach, the tide is always out, so there's no sea? So we can see from these results that the beach, you'd rather that the beach, the tide was out. What do you think about that, Andrew?
I completely agree with that personally. I mean, I am a very pasty individual. And so when I go to the beach, I have to be very careful, use lots of sun cream, otherwise I will burn. And so the beach is not my favourite spot to go. And also, if you think about it, how often do you go to the beach a year? Maybe like 2-3 times in summer. You're going to a restaurant far more often than you're going to the beach. So you're getting a lot more disappointments from the restaurant than you are from the beach. That's my opinion anyway. What do you think?
If you're only going twice a year to the beach, you're not going enough. But I'm going to go the minority, even though it will be sad not to have your order. I often can't decide when I go out to eat what I'm going to choose. So even if I don't get my first choice, I would still be able to get something really great.
That is a fair point. There are lots of options on a menu. There's only one beach. Brilliant. So as well as the Would You Rather, we've also had a competition running. Tonight on theme of disappointment, we've had people send in the most disappointing student meal you've ever had. So let's take a look at some of the entries. This first, I'm not even sure what's disappointing about this one.
Yeah, I mean, is it soup?
I think it's a soup, or it could be a really dodgy porridge, and it kind of looks like custard.
Okay. If it's porridge, I would say that's definitely disappointing.
Yeah.
I also like custard, so if that's custard, I would say that's disappointing.
Yeah, I can see why that would be disappointing. Maybe it's the taste of it. Maybe it didn't taste fantastic.
Yeah,
it's
obviously not
disappointing. What else have we got?
Ooh.
This one doesn't even look that disappointing.
That is a mixture of, I don't even know what that is.
I think I've read the description, and on face value, that's not that disappointing until you realise what's in the bottom right-hand corner is avocado and not pesto.
Okay, that does a weird mix.
I think avocado, I know it's quite popular. I'm not a fan. It tastes a bit weird. The texture doesn't work with me.
I've never tried it, but
I don't think, personally, you're not missing out on anything too major. What else have we got? This is definitely my favourite entry.
I mean, is that meant to be a pepperoni pizza? Or
so I think we can read the box. I think it's a pepperoni pizza, and if I can see correct, that is one piece of pepperoni on that pepperoni pizza.
Surely they were having a joke there.
Either way, that is definitely a disappointing meal.
It is indeed. So great, thanks for sending all those in. We are now going to have a look at what a student from Christchurch, how they've experienced disappointment in the last year.
Thanks for coming to talk to us, James. If you just give us a bit of an introduction, who you are, where you go to uni, what you study.
Hi there, I'm James. I study at Canterbury Christchurch University, studying computing degree, and I'm in my first year.
Great, thank you. So this year has been disappointing for us all, but I know you've had some really big disappointments within the last year. If you would like to share some of those with us.
I think what I found disappointing about this last year has been how the COVID-19 pandemic has had such an impact on life in general. For me, sixth form college came to an abrupt end when the government announced the first lockdown back in March 2020. I didn't get to say goodbyes to my contemporaries or finish my coursework and take my exams. Fortunately, I'd kept up to date with my work and I'd always submitted my coursework on time, which did work in my favour. Even though we'd been COVID-free, we experienced hospital care when we phoned 101 as my dad was in pain following similar symptoms to what he'd had when he'd had kidney stones in the past. At this point, we went into hospital and was sent into A&E, where he was given strong painkillers and was asked to come back in the morning and attend a scan. However, this moved very quickly, and we went back later on that in the middle of the night, and we took him back to hospital, and he was then admitted to hospital in a COVID-free part, where he stayed for around 2 to 3 days, I think it was in the end. This meant that we weren't allowed to visit him, and due to medication and things he was on, he was not very responsive at the time, which was very hard for us to even get any communication with him. Two of my grandparents, my dad's parents, lived in a care home and the home went into lockdown straight away, so we weren't allowed to visit them. Sadly, this turned out to be the last time I was able to see them. I'd often went in to help my granddad with his computer because he always seemed to have something going wrong on it. He lived with congestive cardiac failure, which had turned for the worst, and then was hospitalised in a COVID-free part of the hospital in late June, and he died on the 4th of July, the day that the pubs reopened. Fortunately, my mum and dad were allowed into the hospital at the very end of his life, and they were able to have my auntie, who lived in New Zealand, FaceTiming at that point. Because of the semi-lifting of the restrictions, my mum and dad were granted permission to plan my nana. However, this had to be done in the garden wearing full PPE, and this meant no physical contact. But my nana kind of collapsed into my mum's arms, where she couldn't do anything but hug her. This was awful and so intensive for us as a family.
Thank you for sharing. And I don't think disappointing is quite the right word for the year you seem to have had. But are there ways that you have coped with these disappointments that have happened to you?
Okay, so fortunately for me, I was taking part in a church Zoom weekend. So I was being supported by this beyond Zoom whilst all this was happening. I remember feeling very lonely and almost angry because I'm an only child, so usually we did family things together, and this wasn't possible at the time. More recently, my nana died on Christmas Day. She's had dementia, and although the GP had said that she was nearly the end of her life, she wasn't expected to pass away that soon. By then, we were in various tears, so I'd been joining my nana on FaceTime, but all these face-to-face visits had stopped. My mum and dad had been allowed to visit her for half an hour on Christmas Eve, family visits due to government concession. Their funerals were number restricted, and we weren't able to meet with anyone afterwards, and we still don't know when we'll be able to do this either. I haven't been home to Hampshire since I started university, and I haven't physically seen my mum and dad since October, before the second lockdown. I haven't really had the opportunity to meet and bond with others on my course, so because of this, very little actual coursework on the university campus has happened, which really hasn't had an impact on me getting to know people. I wasn't able to play in orchestras and bands due to the government restrictions, so this also led to me not being able to say goodbye to my friends in different bands and orchestras.
So you said that through all of these disappointments, you were able to meet on Zoom with people from church who were able to support you. What difference has your Christian faith made to the disappointments that you have faced?
On the plus side, throughout this, my college did continue on Zoom or socially distanced picnics until we went our separate ways. I'm still in contact with a lot of these people still. I'm a national youth rep for the Methodist Church, and we should have had our annual youth conference last October at the NEC. However, this had to be cancelled, but we still prepared various resources to be used by children and young people back at their churches via Zoom. I've been part of a small group. This followed on from when we attended Self Survivor a few years ago. I'm in a National Methodist Youth Brass Band, where we have been keeping contact by quiz nights, etc. And the fact that all these other groups as well, we've been doing film nights and quiz nights. I've become involved, as you know, with Christchurch Christian Union, which has enabled me to meet folk via Zoom. I've been very fortunate as I've been living in my grandma's home. I'm lucky as I have plenty of space as I live upstairs. We've been able to keep each other company. I think if I'd lived in university halls in these COVID times, I'd have felt very lonely. I've enjoyed walking socially distanced, of course, praying on a few occasions when I've been able to take my grandma to her own church as well in the morning, and then attend SMB in the evening, which has really helped me to ground myself and know that God is with me as I'm embarking on a Christian journey in these difficult times. There's been times when I really questioned why my prayers haven't been answered, the way I thought they should be. But recently I've found that I must put the trust in God and He will provide for my needs when the time is right.
So thank you so much for coming and talking with us today. Thank you.
Wow, that's really, really powerful. Thanks for sharing that with us, James. Now let's welcome our guest speaker this evening, Joe.
Yeah, hi Joe. Thanks for joining us again. For those who may not know you, could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Joe. I live up in York at the moment, and I work with students up here exploring important questions about life and helping Christians to think through how to live out their faith at uni.
Great. And the important question, our would you rather of today, Joe, would you rather if you went out for a meal, they'd never have your order, or if you went to the beach, that the tide would always be out?
Oh,
you know what? It's tough.
Yeah, I'm a seaside boy, right? So I grew up on the south coast, Littlehampton, and the tide being out, I think, is just a bit of an inconvenience. So I think I'd probably go for that. And to be honest, I quite like the idea of going to a restaurant and not picking something that I'd always pick. Yeah. Or wait, was it more that they didn't have the order that I'd already chosen?
What you wanted.
Oh right, yeah, that does really change things.
But it still forces you to choose something new on the menu.
Oh well, yeah, tide out. That would be the worst scenario. Yeah.
I agree. And whilst Joe's speaking, if you have any questions that you'd like to be answered later on, do use the Slido code, which will be in the chat. But for now, Joe, I'll hand over to you.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you so much. Really good to virtually be with you again, as I was on Tuesday. And thanks so much for tuning in this week and exploring a bit more about some of the themes that we've been discussing together. I've particularly appreciated getting your comments in answers to the opening countdown questions. I'm loving Angus Mitchell's "I can't wait to go to Spoons once lockdown is over." There we go. A man amused by small things. And Ash's "living with some great friends." Excellent. The sunshine has cheered Becca up. Amazing. Well, good to get those in, and really good to be chatting about this theme of disappointment with you this evening. And I want to start by helping you to picture a scene with me. Just picture this: lapping waters at a white sandy beach. The tide is in. Aerial shots zoom up and we see fancy yachts with bronzed, suntanned people drinking margaritas, having the time of their life. And this is all soundtrack to this chill, lo-fi, kind of jazzy number that suddenly then lets rip into a filthy EDM synthy drop, where we see pictures of thousands of people partying like they've never partied before. And then the soundtrack gives way and we hear words come over the top of these images, and we hear this narration: the actual experience exceeds all expectations. Into something that's hard to put into words. All these things that may seem big or impossible or not gives people that type of energy, that type of power. I wonder if you recognize those words. Actually, they're originally the famous words of an astronaut called Ashloy Asare when describing seeing the Earth for the first time from out of space. But I first heard them when watching the trailer to Fire Festival. I wonder if you've seen it on Netflix. If you haven't, you should. It is mental. Touted as the most glamorous and exclusive festival going to ever take place, it ended up being a laughable flop. The money ran out, acts were cancelled. They underestimated the time that they'd need to just pull the whole thing off. It was a travesty. And it meant that a ton of rich Instagram kids went there hoping for the time of their life and were met with hurricane relief tents and ropey sandwiches in polystyrene containers. The greatest party that never happened, Netflix billed it as. And it's maybe the greatest mismatched of expectations, reality meets hope that I've ever seen, at least on screen. And I wonder if it actually helps us to get to know a bit of what disappointment is and how it works. See, the reaction to Fire Festival on Netflix amongst some people was just glee. People took it all in with chirpiness, reveling in other people's misfortune. People found it hilarious that all these, in their eyes, entitled Instagram kids with nothing better to do with their lives have been pulled back a peg or two. For others, it seemed as if this was always going to be too good to be true. That this actually reveals something that duped all of us into thinking that this vision of exhilaration and a lack of disappointment actually was never going to cut the mustard. And it reveals something, I think, about how we see disappointment working out in our own lives. Now, I don't mean this in a too mean girls type way, but if we're being very real about disappointment, which is what this whole week is about, sometimes in our worst moments, we see someone else disappointed who's got it good, and it kind of makes us feel a bit better about the disappointments in our own lives. At our worst, maybe it's that mate at school or uni that you're always in competition with, who didn't get the better grade than you, who didn't get the part in the show, or the first rugby team at Kent or Canterbury Christchurch that you could have got. It would show you up a bit. It makes us feel maybe a little bit better if we're honest with ourselves about the disappointments we know deep down don't really work for us. And it doesn't really work to do that with our disappointment. It ends up leaving two people disappointed in the long run. Actually, it's more of a mirror of the self-involved effects of us living for ourselves rather than living for a good God, Christians would suggest. But maybe the other thing Fire Festival showed us in this fear of being duped by something that's too good to be true is that for all of us, we have those pipe dreams of things in our lives that we're skeptical, reticent to give into, such that we'll too be disappointed in the long run. Now, disappointment takes many forms. It's one thing, isn't it, to just sort of mope around the house with minor disappointments turning into frustration, isn't it? Like the washing up's not been done again. Someone's left the toilet lid up again, and you don't like that. A mate that you miss has just left you on red and they've just gone a bit flaky and you're disappointed. And you end up dealing with it. We all end up dealing with it in a kind of very British, cynical way, don't we? We'll deal with it, grit our teeth and get by. That's just life. Life's a bit disappointing. But then we have those next level disappointments, the cancelled 21st parties, the graduation ceremonies that didn't quite go down in the end, and disappointed at the way maybe that the government have handled the whole COVID restriction thing. And we do this kind of happy-ish British thing of just dealing with it and getting by because, you know, life's just a bit mess sometimes, even with those level of disappointments. And a bit like Fire Festival, we don't want to be burnt by promises that seem too good to be true. So we just accept they're not. But what about real disappointment? That's what our theme is for tonight. What about next level disappointments that it's not good enough to just sort of laugh cynically at or deal with? Maybe it's the COVID restrictions that wreck a career and lose jobs. Maybe it's the heartbreak of a long-term relationship going down the pan, expecting that it would last a long time, maybe even a lifetime. Or even the virus tragically taking the life of a loved one in your family or friendship group. I was really heartened and felt for James in sharing his story. What honesty, what an amazing story to share. Thank you. And maybe it's that kind of disappointment, along with James, that you're experiencing right now. And you're thinking, is there ever actually a way out? Is there actually anything that we can respond with here that's hopeful? Now, I don't think I've seen any kind of level of response in that way from the world around me often. And I think my disappointment was checked in a very realistic way when I first bumped into a couple of friends in Subotica in Serbia. They were refugees from Damascus in Syria, and I was there speaking a bit like I am tonight at the university. And they were refugees on the way to Germany to basically restart their life after their house was shelled out. And I asked them, what's the one thing you'd most like back? One thing you most want now in your life? Is there any way I can help? And I remember Khalil and Hanan, my friends. Khalil just turned to me and went, I just want to feel my back against a wall again. Wow. Now, it's a disappointment that turned on its head and ended up being a story of hope, as I saw on Facebook and kept in touch with them after that they'd ended up getting to Germany. But they were stuck at the Hungarian border for ages, making their way to restart their livelihoods. And it brought to mind some words from a Japanese poet called Kobayashi Isha, who said, this world is a world of dew. That disappointment sticks to us like the morning dew on our shoes, and we just can't really escape it. It's just always there. Life will always let us down. But his poem didn't stop there. He went, this world is a world of dew, and yet. He couldn't leave the poem there because we can't help but hope, but long that disappointment won't be the final word. That there will be a vaccine round the corner, that there will be an amazing party, that there will be a miraculous recovery, that there will be a new boyfriend, girlfriend down the line that will work this time. So what do we do with this awkward middle ground where disappointment and hope collide and we don't know what to do with it because we're British? Maybe if you're tuning in and you're an international student and thinking, I relate to the Kobayashi Isha thing. These Brits are nuts. Hey, I'm kind of with you. But what do we do when life disappoints? Here's my suggestion. You turn to the only one who will shoulder the burden of every disappointing thing you'll ever go through in your life, and the one who is also mighty enough to promise a permanent way out of endless disappointment and keep his word. I've not come from a religious background. I came into trusting in this Jesus later in life. But my suggestion is the only one I found to be like this is Jesus. And so for the rest of our time, we're just going to look at one of his stories in Mark 5 together. Mark is an ancient eyewitness newspaper exploring the life and times of Jesus. And in this story, we see Jesus meeting a woman in need. So I'm just going to read out a couple of opening lines from this story, and then we'll look through it together. So the story starts like this. Verse 24. So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressured round him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she had only got worse. Gosh, what a shocking thing to read. What a disheartening moment for this woman. Jesus is on his way to meet another need elsewhere in a throng of people crowding round him, wanting a piece of him. And here's a woman in the same crowd who has a need that far outweighs maybe some of our needs and disappointments in our lives. She's desperate, really desperate. It mentions here 12 years that she'd been in this constant cycle of hurt. And it's 12 years where her life really looked like a complete mess. She'd been at the hands of many doctors, none of which had done anything about her condition. She was a woman undergoing menstrual hemorrhaging, the such which in a Jewish culture, which was heavy-handed and honestly quite pressurizing towards women, that looked backward in some ways to the society that we are in now, she would be shamed for. In fact, menstrual hemorrhaging at the time would deny your right to go into the temple like everyone else, at least for up to 7 days after your period. You were considered unclean, impure. And here's 12 years of dealing with that kind of disappointment, of being shunned and shamed and let out of the places everyone else could go to. Just imagine that kind of baggage and emotional weight and disappointment being dealt with. And on top of all of that, here are the two most tragic things, I think, about something that's described in the original Greek as torment and scraggly for her. The disappointment for me is twofold beyond all of the initial disappointment. One, she'd suffered for 12 years, spent all she had. She's had no money. Doctors couldn't do anything. And not only had she just remained at the same level of pain, she'd got worse. Do you see that there? She'd spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. Oh, my dad has chronic fatigue syndrome and for 15 years has had to deal with constant battling of disappointments and has had to basically cost his own life, in a sense, give up some of his life for the sake of maintaining a good quality level of life to carry on. Imagine doing all of that and then by the end of it just getting worse. Gosh. And then maybe the thing that terrifies me, maybe even more than that, is that this 12 years is 12 years of her life that she'll never get back. Think of all of the things you could fit into that 12 years. 4 University of Kent or Canterbury Christchurch undergraduate degrees. 3 entrepreneurial startup businesses. The lion's share of a professional footballer's career. Whatever it might be, the whole thing is stolen from her. She's had to trudge through treacle with this condition and shame and shunning for nearly her whole life. And it's awful, it's disheartening. And maybe we look at this kind of thing and we think, just how, God, could you let that kind of thing happen? It's terrible. What kind of God would allow that kind of shun and shame and distress to dominate someone's life and define their story? And maybe for us, if we look at our own sense of suffering and things, I talked about the other day a depression diagnosis on Tuesday. These things can feel debilitating and disappointing at best. Where do we look? Where do we take our disappointments? I think Matty Healy of the 1975 gets some way to talking about how, particularly in British 21st century culture, we try and deal with it. He sings this: irony is okay, I suppose. Culture is to blame. You try and mask your pain in the most postmodern way. You lack substance when you say something like, oh, what a shame. It's just a self-referential way that stops you having to be human. I.e., we let things bubble underneath the surface with sarcasm or laughter to just mask this restless ache for disappointments to fade and for us to get a life back again that we want to live. This world is a world of dew, and maybe we just sit in that. And maybe we imagine it would be easier if we just banish God from the equation whatsoever. We just imagine there to be nothing behind everything, and then that's our lot. But part of the issue is we don't actually get anywhere close to delivering on the issue here. We don't get an answer that's worth it. We just get to nothing behind everything, and we're left with life is just it. It's like you can just go through life imagining that things happen, that nature is red in tooth and claw, and that's the way it's always meant to be, and that's it. But that doesn't get to the heart of the issue. And actually, in that question of why, God, would you allow something like this, the value of the question is actually in the person we're asking the question for, be it us or someone else. We have to assume that people are worthy of inherent dignity, that life is sacred and precious. And for the suffering question to even be asked, we have to assume that there's a God big enough who would orchestrate all of life to be sacred and precious and go the way of good, to match with our instincts for good to win out in the end. Otherwise, nothing is behind everything, and we're just guided by evolutionary forces that sing to the tune of DNA and nothing more. So what if you could live a life of honest transparency here, where it was possible for something to be done about your pain and suffering, where you accept when you need help and yet laugh off the things that also don't need to matter as much, where you could make sense of both major and minor disappointment? Well, we read on in this story and we get to verse 27. When she had heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. At once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned round in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" "You see the people crowding against you," his disciples answered, "and yet you can ask, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. Okay, here's where it starts to get really dramatic. This woman is pushing through the crowds. She's so desperate that she needs her bleeding to be released, that she reaches out to this man she's heard reports about, of him performing amazing, extraordinary things, touches his cloak, and instantly years and torment of shame and physical distress and constant bleeding dry up. And she's left thinking, what on earth has just happened? She's freed. She reaches out to touch another that she thinks she's going to infect, and suddenly the only one who seems to be able to get close enough and not only disinfect, but has the power to totally change the trajectory of someone's life is there in front of her. This Jesus she's heard about. The condition doesn't touch him. Instead, she is completely healed. Wow. This is an amazing demonstration of one who acts and talks and performs things that only God could do. And right the way through Mark, we hurtle through stories of people in desperation and distress, besieged by disappointment after disappointment, and Jesus meets them in their distress and desperation and changes the story. Here we have a God who, right the way through Mark, opens blind eyes, calms storms, heals bleeding, hemorrhaging women, and then would ultimately go to a cross with all of that power and might in him, establishing a new kingdom, would ultimately go to a cross for her. We see this miracle has happened, but something even more remarkable happens in just the next sentence. So verse 33, then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at his feet and, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." We get the women's desperation here, and I think she's right to be desperate. But what happens next is no giddy party where she's celebrating in a kind of fire festival type dupe. "Oh, I finally got what I've always needed." She's shocked to her core. And going after Jesus, she's shocked because a power that is extraordinary beyond anything that she's ever encountered before has just healed her, dried her, and healed years of torment and shame. And she goes towards him and trembles. It's a right fitting response if this is a God who is healer, if this is a God who has a stake in our lives and wants us to be with him forever. We see in the last few lines that Jesus doesn't just stop at healing. He's not just one for dispensing miracles. He goes after her. He wants an encounter with her. He wants to experience her. He wants a relationship with her. And here we have a woman coming and trembling in the same way that the disciples trembled on the boat as Jesus calmed the storm. I think we heard of that last night. And in the same way that the first ever women witnesses to Jesus's resurrection, a tomb being empty and their whole world suddenly collapsing, thinking this guy's dead and I followed him and now he's alive, were also trembling and bewildered too. We see the first response here isn't always happy, clappy, fluffy. In fact, it never really is. It's real. They come before a God of everything and are stunned and are shocked. It's a power unlike any other. And it's a power that not only is enacted in our lives now, or can be enacted in our lives now, but it's a power that ultimately Jesus will take to the cross and die for us with. Jesus would walk a path far more desperate, even far more disappointing than this woman, and would walk carrying the ruined effects of the world we live in, the shame that we hide, the covering of stuff in the dark, the effects of a world that's grubby and impure, like the very condition that haunted that woman. And then he will go and die as the darkness overlaid the land, so says Mark's gospel, as he hung himself up, subject to the weight of the world's sin being laid upon him, and he would take it upon himself and undo it completely by dying. And in that one moment, we get a precursor here of just what this man, Jesus, has done for this woman, because he calls her daughter. She's no longer in it. She's no longer shunned or shamed or ostracized from society. She's called child. She's loved, valued, loved with such ferocity that Jesus would go to the cross for her and you and I. Because far more impure than this woman's condition and this shunned suffering that she felt was a condition that gets to all of us. That means we turn in on ourselves and look for solution to our disappointment within, and it never cuts it. In fact, we did that right from the start as we turned from a God of, as I said on Tuesday, light and love and life, and turned to other things to make them gods in our lives that only God could take the place of. And Jesus went and died in our place for that, so we could be forgiven and have a foretaste, a picture of what was to come, a restoring, life-giving kingdom being set up forever. And we get a foretaste of that even in this next line. Here's this last line we'll look at this evening. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." She's freed. She's healed. And this is something that's promised right from the moment that Jesus rises from the grave. So says the gospel accounts about him. Is this death won't be the end, disappointment won't win out type mentality. It's a real approach that gets to the heart of our suffering and says, you're freed, you're forgiven, and you can have peace with me forever. And you know, that kind of hope can take you through any and every disappointment in your life. Knowing Jesus is with you, knowing even that he may upturn some of those disappointments in the meantime, but with the promise of a word that is carried to the grave and risen above and will last for you forever. A word that you can trust in, which is Jesus rising and coming to you and saying, daughter, son, go in peace because you know me now. That kind of hope can qualitatively transform someone's entire life. I just want to end on some of these words from Lord of the Rings. It's a moment where hope seemed to be dying and disappointment seemed to be the narrative that would dominate Sam and Frodo's walk to Mordor. And we hear this at the moment that Sam hears of Gandalf returning in the books. Hear these words. But even as hope died in Sam, or seemed to die, it was turned to a new strength. and he felt through all his limbs a thrill, as if he was turning into some creature of stone and steel that neither despair nor weariness nor endless barren miles could subdue. The promise of resurrection hope in the Christian faith is a hardening, a resilience to make our way through disappointment, not with a hardened, cynical persona, but with one that is steely and has stone, because hope is real and because disappointment will one day no longer be here. That's the kind of story that Jesus wants to set up. That's the kind of story that Jesus wants to set up for you in your life. So, hey, I'm just going to end with a prayer and I'm going to talk to God. And for some of you out there that are thinking, oh, I've just had this cycle of things constantly getting to me, things going wrong, disappointments, and I don't know where to turn. Can I encourage you? Turn to Jesus now. He is so worth it. He's so full of hope. He's so full of love for you. Just look at what he did for this woman. If you'd like to do that with me, why not own your part in this woman's story as we talk to God together and I pray. Let me pray. Make these words your own. Father, thank you so much that you love us and identify with us in human form in Jesus. Thank you that you are God of everything and nothing is an accident to you. But thank you that you don't leave us in the lurch with tremendous disappointment. Thank you that you would get close enough to that woman such that her condition would be dried up, and she would be healed and free. And thank you that you get close enough to us that you know the things that we cover, the things that fill us with shame, and you say, go in peace and be healed too. God, forgive us for playing our part in detaching ourselves from you. And I pray, Lord, that we would receive your sacrifice on the cross for us and know your resurrection power in our lives that can strengthen us through any disappointment and promise us one day a world without disappointment at all. We ask this in your name. Amen. Thank you so much for listening along. I'm just now going to invite up the hosts. If you prayed that prayer, why not get in touch with someone in the CU and chat more? I'm sure they'd love that. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. Well, hopefully what Joe said may have caused some questions or it may have stirred some thoughts. But we've got some questions through on Slido. Please do send in questions as you think of them. I think we've got a couple on YouTube as well in the comments. So keep sending on your questions. We'll get through as many as we can. And we would love to hear from you and try and answer your questions. So let's dive in.
Yeah, so we have got some great questions. So the first one is, how do I know that God won't disappoint me when so many bad things have already happened?
Yeah, really good question. I think some way to answering this question is by looking at these stories themselves and believing that God is always one that holds us close in trouble. So we cannot say of God that he is one that is just cold and ignorant to our suffering, or cold and ignorant to our disappointment, however superficial or light they may be. But what we see here in Jesus isn't someone who's aloof. We see a Jesus who gets close, identifies with us in our weakness, but changes up the narrative, such that even if you were to go through a life of suffering now, turning everywhere else, you wouldn't be disappointed. I think it's worth saying there are many things that we look to that we think will give us that kind of ultimate transformation in disappointment. There's a psychologist called Esther Perel that talks about us looking upon a loved one, be it a family member or romantic partner. And she talks about us asking of them, give me transcendence, give me awe, give me mystery, give me continuity, but also give me surprise, give me everything. And then she ends it with going, and only fickle human beings or toys and lingerie can deal with that. And I think what she's saying there is we lump this burden of being not disappointed on anyone else, and it will let us down. Even if they're the best kind of friend in the world, we're all fallible. But you lump it on God and come to him, honest and real, And here's one who will shoulder any and every burden. And ultimately, his word is true and he keeps his promises. He's coming back and he's going to transform a world and rid it of all disappointment, including your life. And so he's worth trusting in.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe. We've got another question come in. So this is on the topic of what we saw in the passage. So we know that Jesus is powerful and he's powerful to stop disappointments or suffering. But the question reads, if Jesus has that kind of power, why doesn't he stop the disappointments we face?
Oh, yeah. Really good question. I was hoping someone would ask it as well. It's the begging question, isn't it? Okay, is God kind and loving here for this woman, but then not kind and loving for me in my distress? And ultimately, I'd be letting you down if I was to say there's a neat one-size-fits-all trite answer to why you feel the way you do, why you've been buffered by disappointments you have and haven't had a way out. I'm sure actually the woman 12 years before this encounter, or even 6 years before, halfway through, would be asking the same thing. She's heard of stories. Maybe she's even heard of stories of Jesus circulating around the time of Mark's gospel, days before meeting him, thinking, why not me? And in a sense, all of us, all of our lives on this earth are always asking, why not me? I asked why not me with being diagnosed with an eating disorder when I was younger, of having a family that was split apart. I've seen some real personal tragedy with my mum's debt situation. Why God? Why God? And instead of coming with a one-size-fits-all answer, God comes with something even better. He comes by giving himself, such that this endless disappointment would be undone completely one day. That was the only way it could work. It's not a lottery jackpot system where we go to God and he gives us what we want temporarily and then we go back and he gives us another thing. No. The other thing to mention though with this is some of these failures, disappointments, loss, they're not just to be avoided. Outside of a Christian worldview, these things basically are, because they don't contribute anything to our lives. But inside a Christian worldview, trusting in Jesus, these things build character, even have fortitude, and bring us closer into a relationship with God. Empower us to not just look within, but be selfless with what God has given us and be loving to the outsider. All of these things, I probably wouldn't be talking to you now, actually, as a Christian, had I not gone through an eating disorder in the early part of my journey. So don't hear that God is for suffering, that he wants you to live in distress. He doesn't cause it, but do hear that he is for you, loves you, has the power to change lives and does still today. But even if temporarily that does not happen, it's not lost or wasted. Rather, in the economy of God's kingdom, these things strengthen and soften us such that we can be used for God's purposes and love each other better. I hope that gets some way. I realize that's a real personal question maybe, so feel free to get in touch after.
Great, thanks. Another question we have is, how do I forgive someone who's disappointed me and why should I?
Yeah, wow. And I don't know, I can't pretend to know the kind of world that person inhabits right now, what they might be experiencing. You know, maybe you're experiencing something similar to the woman in this story, this kind of storm of shame and guilt and shunning and disappointment, knowing you've been hurt and harmed by people. I think the one thing to say here is that God is in Jesus is not only close to the woman in her distress. Interestingly, he's close in this story to the crowds. And the crowds are really more out of touch with Jesus than the woman is. The woman literally touches Jesus's cloak, but these crowds are just concerned about seeing something spectacular, are just concerned about what God could do for them, are just concerned about themselves. And really, when we're on the receiving end of harm, often it's because people are only out for themselves, right? I know that I've committed harm in that way and received harm in that way, and it's crushing. So when we've been disappointed by someone like that, we look to the example of a God who gets close to the woman, but also gets close to the crowds, and ultimately would, because he wants to get close to everyone in distress, but also everyone in their selfishness, goes and gives himself up on the cross such that we could be bridged back to him forever. And I certainly know times, even I've described some of my suffering tonight, but I also know times that I've just been foul with people because I'm in a place where I'm hurting or whatever. And so God calls us to forgive because we've been forgiven first by him. And it's in the nature of someone that's been renewed by God as a child, as a daughter or a son, to then go out and forgive likewise.
Brilliant, thanks. So another question we've got in, I think it's coming from someone who has been a Christian, at least in the past. And it says, what if I've been disappointed by Christianity before? Why should I come back?
Yeah. Honestly, you could go on living the rest of your life, I think, carrying that kind of disappointment, being burnt by religion, and not want to give it another hearing. And I'd sympathize with you there. I've not come from a religious home myself. I didn't grow up in a Christian family. I saw some pretty frustrating, well, more than frustrating, downright disappointing things from the church institution itself, where God's followers are just very poor tribute acts to the real thing. God doesn't leave us with just a poor tribute act, though. And so if you've been disappointed by religion before, disappointed by God even, I think it could be one of two things. It could be that you've looked maybe at people around you who are meant to represent Jesus, who have harmed, who have disappointed, who have left you bewildered, but not in a good way. And my suggestion there would be look first at the OG, look first at Jesus. Don't base your perspective on Christianity on people following him first. Maybe though, you come to God and you're expecting something and it didn't happen, and so why turn back to him now? Couple of things here. The first thing I'd say is, if I trust in God now, as I did when I became a Christian at 17, I have to accept that his perspective on things is just so much more sizable, is greater, is more beautiful than mine. And so he shoulders burdens in time that I can't even carry upon myself. And I know that if he were to come through and answer something specifically in a moment that later down the line turns sour because it's my thing and not his thing, then I would much rather trust his thing, knowing that even if for a moment I may be disappointed, but later down the line I won't be. I'd say as well, hey, similar to that 1975 quote I shared, if there's no one behind anything, if there's nothing behind anything, it's kind of trendy to be spiritual now a bit, isn't it? Even if we're not that into religion. And I think there's a right instinct there, because actually all of the things that we love about life, goodness and non-disappointment, have to sprawl from something. And if not a God of light and love and life, well, where else will you look? You know, nature is just red in tooth and claw, and that's it. You're disappointed and you're not, and that's it. If there's a God behind things, though, wow, well, that just gives a totally different color to life, doesn't it? So that would be my answer there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Joe, for answering those questions. That's all the time we've got for questions for now. But please do keep sending them in, and we'll stay in touch, and we will try and answer them either tomorrow evening with the last event we've got, or we'll reach out on social media in some description, and we'll stay in touch. But Bryony, what have we got next?
So it is now the time we've all been waiting for this evening, to find out the winner of the competition. So, Andrew, drum roll, please. The winner is, hopefully it will come up, is Becca. So well done, Becca.
A worthy winner, a very worthy winner.
Hopefully you'll be able to get a proper pepperoni pizza now with your voucher. So well done and enjoy that. And we have one last competition tomorrow, so do tune back in tomorrow, backed by popular demand. It is very simple. You will need to tag 2 friends on the Instagram post and share it to your story for an extra entry. So do that tomorrow for a chance to win the last voucher.
Brilliant. So hopefully this evening you've learned something new. Perhaps you've started thinking in a different way, or perhaps you've even given your life to Jesus. Whatever it is, we would love to stay in touch after this week finishes. There are 3 ways to get in touch. The first was the Buddy Scheme, which the CU is running. So the Christian Unions in Canterbury are running a scheme where you can get in touch with someone from the Christian Union, someone to ask your questions, to have deep conversations with, or really shallow conversations, whatever you want to talk about. They're there to talk to you. You can go for a social distance walk, have a phone call, read a book together, have a Netflix party together, whatever you fancy. But they're there to support you during lockdown.
We also have an Alpha course, which is just a great opportunity to ask more questions, to read the Bible, and to find out more about Jesus.
Brilliant. And the last way, you can get in touch with our social media channels on Facebook or Instagram. We'll also be putting in some follow-up forms in the chat and in the comments on YouTube and on Facebook. Chances to let us know what you thought of the event, how can we improve it, what do you think about it, and to stay in touch with us. But that's all we have time for this evening, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Bye.